In 2005 in California, a college student is going through the final night of a fraternity initiation. He's made to do calisthenics in the basement in raw sewage that leaked onto the floor for hours. And every so often, he's handed a jug of water and told to drink. Partway through, he collapses and has a seizure. Later at the hospital, he's pronounced dead. Everyone assumed he was pushed too hard exhaustion, infection, the exercise. But the real cause of death? Water. So, how is it possible that the same substance we can't live more than 3 days without can kill you? To understand that, we need to answer a different question first. And even stranger, the answer is tangled up with something you've probably asked yourself before. Why does water taste different in different places? Well, let's get to it. Your body isn't actually asking for water. Not exactly. What it's really trying to maintain is balance. And water is just the vehicle carrying the things that make that balance possible. Things like sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, minerals that carry an electrical charge when they're dissolved in water. In other words, electrolytes. And those charges are what let your nerves fire and your muscles contract. Every heartbeat, every thought, every twitch of a finger. It's electricity running through a body that's mostly water, controlled by minerals. So, if these minerals are so important, where do they actually come from? Because when you look at the water in your glass, it doesn't look like it's carrying anything. It's just H2O, two hydrogen atoms bonded to a single oxygen atom. That's what water is. But that's not really what's in your glass. Pure H2O, with essentially nothing else dissolved in it, is what you get from something like distilled water. The water coming out of your tap is H2O carrying a whole cocktail of other substances, mostly minerals. And there's actually a number that tells you roughly how much of that stuff there is in there. TDS, total dissolved solids. We'll come back to that number and why it matters in a bit. But first, we need to understand how those minerals got into the water in the first place. It all starts out with rain, because rain starts out surprisingly close to pure water. Water evaporates, rises into the atmosphere, condenses, and eventually falls back down. And when that rain lands on a mountain, it doesn't just sit there. It seeps into the cracks of the rock and it travels through layers of stone, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades. And as it moves, it slowly dissolves tiny amounts of whatever it's passing through. This process is called leaching. Water that passes through limestone can pick up calcium and magnesium. Water moving through different types of volcanic rock can pick up completely different trace minerals. So two spring waters from two different mountains can taste completely different because the water is carrying a chemical fingerprint of the rock it traveled through. And this is something you've probably noticed yourself. Take a drink of water on holiday and it tastes completely different from the water back home. Some water feels heavy, some tastes almost salty. Some feels thin, like there's almost nothing there. And that difference is largely influenced by what's dissolved in it. Which brings us back to that number in the label. TDS, total dissolved solids, is essentially a measurement of how much material is left behind when you remove the water itself. Some spring water contains only a few dozen milligrams per liter. Others contain several hundreds. And the more minerals there are, the more noticeable the water can become on your tongue. Heavier, more mineral-like, sometimes slightly salty. At the extreme end, you can get water that's so mineral rich, it almost stops behaving like what we think of ordinary drinking water. There's a spring in Slovenia with a natural magnesium concentration so high that its total dissolved solids exceed 9,000 milligrams per liter. For comparison, ordinary spring water is often in the hundreds. That's an enormous amount of dissolved material. But this raises a strange question. If the minerals in water are so important, what happens when there are basically none? That's where distilled water and reverse osmosis come in. Both processes can strip most of the dissolved minerals out of water, leaving it with extremely low TDS. It can look incredibly clean and it can taste incredibly clean. But here's the important distinction. Clean isn't the same thing as nutritionally complete. Your body needs electrolytes, and most of the minerals you actually need do come from food, not from what you drink. So one glass of distilled water isn't going to hurt you. But make it your only water long term, and the story gets a bit stranger. The same pool that lets water dissolve rock on its way through a mountain doesn't switch off once it's sitting in a bottle. Give it nothing to dissolve, and some research suggests that it'll keep looking, even inside you. The World Health Organization has actually flagged this. People who rely on demineralized water long term show increased mineral loss, How much that matters day to day is still debated, but it's real enough that the WHO stops short of calling demineralized water the safe, healthy default people assume it is. Which tells us something important about the story we're following. Water itself isn't doing the important work. It's the balance of water and dissolved substances that matters. And now we can finally go back to the college student, because none of this has yet explained how water actually killed him. Here's the part that sounds almost too backward. He didn't die because the water was toxic, he died because he drank too much of it too quickly. Your kidneys are incredibly good at removing excess water, but they're not infinitely fast. There's a limit to how quickly they can get rid of water. So if someone drinks water faster than their kidneys can remove it, the water starts accumulating in the bloodstream. And that creates a very specific problem. It dilutes the sodium in your blood. And the sodium isn't just another mineral floating around in your body, it's one of the major electrolytes responsible for controlling how water moves between your bloodstream and your cells. So when the concentration of sodium in your blood falls too low, water starts moving into the cells. The cells swell. Most cells can tolerate some swelling. Your brain, though, is different. Your brain is trapped inside a rigid skull. There's almost no room for it to expand. So as brain cells swell, pressure starts building inside the skull. And once that pressure becomes severe enough, you can get confusion, seizures, coma, and eventually death. This condition is called hyponatremia. And this is what happened to the student. He wasn't poisoned by the water, his body was overwhelmed by it. His body couldn't remove it fast enough. His blood sodium became dangerously diluted and his brain began to swell. But now we've created another problem, because the student was an extreme case. He was being forced to drink enormous amounts of water. So you might reasonably ask, does this only happen when someone drinks a ridiculous amount of water? Well, no. In fact, you can get a similar problem from the opposite direction. Imagine you're running a marathon or walking outside in extreme heat. You're sweating, and sweat isn't just water. You're losing sodium and other electrolytes along with it. So if you replace all of that lost fluid with huge amounts of plain water, pure H2O, while replacing very little of the sodium you've lost, you can gradually dilute the sodium that's still in your bloodstream. The same basic problem can develop. That's why endurance athletes don't just need to think about replacing water. They also need to think about what they're losing in their sweat and drink electrolytes. Now we can flip the equation completely. Because what happens if you don't have too much water? What happens if you have too little? This is where alcohol gives us an interesting example. Alcohol suppresses a hormone that normally tells your kidneys to hold on to water. So you urinate more and you lose fluid, and you can lose electrolytes along with it. That's not the same mechanism as water intoxication. One is primarily a problem of taking in too much water. The other involves losing too much fluid and electrolytes. But underneath both, it's the same thing: balance. Push the balance too far in one direction and you can dilute the electrolytes your body needs. Push it too far in the other and you lose too much water and those same electrolytes. And that brings us back to the original question. How can the substance you need to survive kill you? Because water was never really the thing your body was trying to keep in balance. It was everything around it. Sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium. Water is the medium that allows all of this to work. And when you add vastly more water than your body can handle, you don't make yourself healthier. You destroy the concentration that allows those electrolytes to do their jobs. That's how something essential to life can also become lethal. Not because water is dangerous, but because your body has limits. And there's one final thing worth remembering the next time you're standing in front of a wall of bottled water. The number on the label isn't the score of how healthy your water is. TDS doesn't mean higher is automatically better, and 0 doesn't mean that the water is toxic. What it simply tells you is how much dissolved material there is in the water. If you want to know what you're actually drinking, look beyond the big words in front of the bottle. Look at the mineral composition: calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium, because that's where the interesting part of the water actually is. The water itself is just H2O. The story is everything it carries with it, and ultimately what happens when that balance gets pushed too far.